This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, starts today's show by explaining the Farm Act, a National Environmental Policy Act violation, and the Environmental Protection Administration's draft strategy. Continuing the show is K-State veterinarian Gregg Hanzlicek as he discusses Johne's disease in cattle and how producers can help reduce risk of it in their herd. A portion of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast ends today's show as Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Bob Larson, Brian Lubbers, Phillip Lancaster, and Ken Odde converse about meat demand and consumption. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, talking through a few different topics that are happening in agriculture right now. And the first one, the Farm Assistance and Revenue Mitigation Act, also referred to as the Farm Act. And what is that?
Well, it's a bill that's designed to provide some additional relief in emergency-type situations as a result of low prices in the farm sector right now. So in general, that's what it is. So it's emergency assistance to producers of specified crops, but it's for the 2024 crop year only. And I think the way it works, it could actually result in some large payments to many farmers.
What are those crops in the Farm Act?
All crops are eligible for payments, but those payments are calculated in different ways. If you have one of the 8 major listed crops, such as corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, rice, sorghum, oats, and barley, they use one particular formula for determining the payment. All of the crops use a comparable estimate of gross returns, but a slightly different formula.
You said this is for 2024 crops, and how is this all going to be calculated and mean for farmers and growers?
Well, a farmer's payments will be based on what they actually planted for 2024. So, for example, if I put in 1,000 acres of corn this year and 1,000 acres of soybeans, then the payment's going to be based on 1,000 acres of corn and 1,000 acres of soybeans. It's not based solely on base acres in the program. Plus, I'd also be eligible for an additional 50% of the acres that were prevented from being planted. So it's got a prevented planting component to it also. And I think the really nice feature of the bill is that the Congress has told USDA how to calculate the payments. They have specified the formula. And what they do is they take USDA's projected cost of the crop, subtract off national projected returns, and then whatever that result is, they multiply it by eligible acres, and then times 60%, and that's your total payment.
With the current prices, what are the estimations of what it would be for the 8 major crops?
They are estimating, according to that formula right now, that a producer would get $103 per acre for corn, $48 for soybeans, $82 per acre for wheat. Cotton's $208, rice is $74, and sorghum is $85 per acre. Now, oats is $181 per acre. That's kind of incredible, and barley's $3 per acre.
How does payment of the Farm Act work?
Well, there is a per-person, per-entity limitation, and that's $175,000. Now, ARC or PLC, by comparison, the payment limit is $125,000 per person. So this is $50,000 higher per person, so a separate payment limit. And for individuals as well as entities that don't limit liability, the limit is on a per-person basis. And if you're in an entity that does your farming operation, such as a C corporation or an S corporation or an LLC, then it's at the entity level. So if I got 4 members, for example, of a general partnership, and I'm large enough such that we could each be eligible for a payment of $175,000, that would total $700,000 worth of payments under the Farm Act. But if I'm in an LLC and I have 4 members of the LLC, we'd each have to split the $175,000. So instead of getting $700,000, we'd get $175,000. So it makes a difference as to how you're organized.
At this point, how much is allocated for this act?
Well, about $20 billion, and of that amount, corn would likely be about $6 billion, and soybeans would be about $2.5 billion.
Roger, has it made it through the House of Representatives and Senate at this point?
No, not yet. It's just been a bill that's been introduced in the House by Representative Kelly out of Mississippi. He's a member of the House Ag Committee. I think it does have good bipartisan support. Probably won't pass as is, but I do think a version of it will pass. And it's likely, I would put the odds more than 50% that it would pass, some version of it would pass in the lame duck session of Congress.
And something else we're seeing in agriculture, a National Environmental Policy Act, and how that involves with the wall near Mexico.
Well, the NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, was enacted over 50 years ago, and it's really kind of the groundwork for what became the formation of the EPA back in the early 70s. And then, of course, they have a lot of bureaucratic power to enforce environmental laws of various stripes. And under NEPA, the government is supposed to undertake an economic impact statement anytime there's a major federal action that's involved. And what happened was, of course, when the Biden administration came in, one of the first things that they did was they stopped the border wall with Mexico from being built, and then they eliminated Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. Well, this has had a devastating impact on ranchers and their land along the border. And a group of them, but one in particular, who's the lead plaintiff in this case, they sued to recover their damages. And the claim was that the Biden administration violated environmental law by not conducting an economic impact statement when they discontinued that federal project. And the federal court in D.C. agreed. So that rancher is going to be entitled to damages. What he showed and backed it up with testimony from border officials was that the border was overwhelmed. They were overrun. The illegal entrants, the trespassers basically into the United States, cut his fences, stole water out of his wells, left trash on his property, which his cattle ate, and then subsequently died. The court said, yeah, the government has to consider the impact on the environment when they discontinued a project such as that. And they didn't do that. He's entitled to damages.
And something else, Roger, that's been a topic in agriculture for a while involving herbicides.
Yeah, the EPA has come up with a draft strategy. This is one of these sue and settle situations where they got sued by an environmental group and decided to settle. And what the EPA did was release a draft strategy designed to address their supposed failure to meet their obligations under the Endangered Species Act. And this involves the application of herbicides and other pesticides on farm ground. And actually, the draft strategy would focus on conventional ag herbicides on 264 million acres of farmland that were treated by such chemicals in 2022. And I think a lot of farmers, if this goes into effect, would be impacted by the EPA strategy because more than 90% of species that are listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act have at least some habitat on private land. And about 70% of the endangered or threatened species have over 60% of their total habitat on private land. So this could have a dramatic impact. Now, maybe not so much in Kansas because we don't have nearly the number of endangered or listed species as other states such as Florida and Texas and California do. But this will have an impact if it goes into effect. And what I mean by that is that they're looking at spray drift mitigations, and so a farmer would have to plant windbreaks and hedgerows perhaps, use hooded sprayers, and reduce application rate depending on the level of risk. And one of the most difficult, I think, aspects of the draft strategy would be the buffer zone requirements that the farmer would have to comply with. And potentially every ground spray could require a 200-foot buffer, and aerial applications could require up to a 500-foot buffer. So if you want to think of a 500-foot buffer, that would be approximately the length of a football field, including the end zones, away from the field that's sprayed. And so that could result in a significant acreage not being treated due to the possibility of downwind spray drift.
While we have you on, Roger, also wanting to remind our listeners of the Kansas Income Tax Institute, which is currently taking place.
Yeah, Shelby, we're in the middle of those. We've already completed the first school, which is all online, and now we have the next 6 that are in person. And we've already done Garden City. We're in Hayes today and tomorrow. And then next week we go to Lawrence on the 13th and 14th. And then we've got a break for a bit because I'm on the road with other tax seminars in different parts of the country. And we come back and we get Salina on November 25 and 26. And then we're in Wichita on December 2 and 3, and Pittsburgh at Pitt State University on December 11 and 12, and then finish with 2 hours of tax ethics on December 20. Actually, we have a final online one. I missed that one. The second online one is December 16 and 17. That's fully online, and then finish with 2 hours of ethics, which is a combined in-person and online. I'll do that broadcast from Washburn Law School in one of our classrooms here, and then that will also be available live online also. That's Friday, December 20th, starting about 1 p.m.
And Roger, can you just remind us of the different types of topics that will be covered?
Well, of course, we're heavy on the ag topics because that's the major business in the state of Kansas, and we have a lot of tax preparers that have ag clients and file Schedule F. So that is pretty detailed. We spend about an hour and a half at each school on partnership tax issues. Difficult topic for not only practitioners but IRS, and so we're pounding through some of the common issues with respect to partners issues and partnership issues, inside-outside basis, stock basis, capital basis, those types of issues and partnerships. Then we get into a whole host of other issues, individual issues that are fairly common and some that are not so common, some issues involving small businesses, and then, of course, we address what's going on in IRS that practitioners need to be aware of, what's coming down the pike in terms of new forms. We go through all of that. IRS recently put out the inflation-adjusted numbers for 2025, and of course we make those available to practitioners too. But a lot of things that practitioners are going to have to find themselves dealing with during tax season. We're trying to get them ready for that and deal with those things that are likely to happen.
Where can people find out more information about the topics we talked about today and the Kansas Income Tax Institute?
The agenda and registration links are on the AgManager website. That's through the Department of Ag Econ at K-State, and folks can go there and find more information. They can also contact either me directly or Rich Llewellyn in the Ag Econ department for information about the tax schools.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby. My pleasure.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will put a link where you can find more information about the Kansas Income Tax Institute. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about Johne's disease with K-State veterinarian in Kansas State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory and K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. Greg, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for offering to be here.
Greg, talking about Johne's disease, which is spelled Johne''s, and what is this disease?
Yeah, it's Johne's. You'll hear it called Johnne's, but it's named after Alfred Johne, who was a veterinarian in Germany who first discovered it. So, that's the thing. What it is, it's a bacterial infection caused by Mycobacterium avium subspecies paratuberculosis. We call it MAP for short, but it's a bacteria and it causes a chronic diarrhea, basically a chronic intestinal disease.
How does this happen?
The infection occurs through animals. They have to ingest the organism, and so it's through something contaminated with feces or colostrum and milk, and then some cows in the later stages of the disease can actually pass the organism to the fetus before birth.
So how does it really go from cow to cow, just accidentally getting feces?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to infect an adult, and so if we have an animal that becomes clinical for Johne's, we can be assured that animal became infected probably in the first 6 months of life. But the average age when they start showing clinical signs, which is chronic diarrhea, weight loss, and what we call bottle jaw, is 4 to 5 years of age. So there's a really, really long incubation period in there. Experimentally, we can infect older cows, but it's pretty rare. We don't even really consider that to be an issue.
Is that producers just having to sit and wait around till they're 4 or 5 to know if the cattle have it?
Well, that's another great question because we do have 2 tests. One's a blood and one's a fecal test. But because this organism is so slow growing, we typically are not going to start testing animals until they're 3 years of age. Or for herds that have a lot of Johne's, we'll start at 2, but for most herds, we're going to start at 3 because even if they became infected, say, at a month of age, and we know they're infected, but if we start testing at a year of age, the tests are going to be negative. And it has to do with the slow growing of the organism.
Why is this really a concern for cattle producers and their herds?
Well, it has a lot of repercussions. Number one is it does cause the chronic wasting and the diarrhea, and these animals are unhealthy, and so we're losing some productivity there. The other major thing about this, at least for some of us, is that there's a zoonotic drumbeat out there that suggests that this organism is associated with multiple human diseases. And so controlling it in our cow-calf and our dairy herds is probably very, very important.
We will talk about the zoonotic disease concerns here in a little bit, but first, you mentioned chronic diarrhea, and what causes that?
This organism, it can be found in multiple tissues after the animal becomes infected, but one of the favorite places for it to land is in the small intestine. And it gets into the wall, it gets into some white blood cells, and it hides, but it causes a chronic inflammation. And the inflammation causes a thickness of the small intestine, and that's where most of our nutrients are absorbed. And so these animals, they basically become malnourished because they can't absorb the nutrients out of the intestine. They might be on the best balanced diet ever, but they can't get to the protein and the energy. The protein that's stuck in the intestine, it pulls water out of the circulation, and that's what causes the diarrhea. And so, again, it's just a malabsorption disease that's caused by the thickening of the bowel, especially in the small intestine.
How is this potentially possible to control in herds?
Yeah, it's tough, and it's a purchased disease. And so herds that are negative, and let me make sure that most cow-calf herds are negative. If they become positive, it's more likely they purchased a bull or a heifer or a cow that was infected, that was shedding, and then their young calves got exposed to it, and then it just perpetuates itself through time. And that's the downside of it, is that if we become infected because we can't test until the animals are older, it's at least 4 to 5 years down the road before we know that we're infected, and by then it can be spread, across a lot of the herd.
So since they have to be older to really be able to see it on a test, when should people test throughout the year?
The goal is, if you're positive and you're wanting to prevent the spread of this, you would want to test all your animals that are 3 years of age and older as close to calving as possible. And let me reiterate that just because they're positive for yonis on the test doesn't mean they're shedding. We don't really care if they're positive. We just need to get the shedders away. And so testing every adult 3 years of age and older and removing them from the herd before calving so that the next calf crop is not exposed to the feces and everything else, that's key to controlling this disease.
How can people know if their livestock are shedders?
The blood test will tell you. There'll be an SP ratio that we'll provide through our laboratory, and from that number, and they can call and we can talk about it, but from that number we can tell whether they're shedding or not. And then the test on the feces is a PCR, and it's looking for the DNA of the organism. So if we find it, then they're shedding. So there's 2 ways of determining that.
Any recommendations on doing a blood test versus doing a feces test?
It's a little bit controversial, but the true Yonis experts recommend that for purebred herds that probably the fecal PCR is the way to go. And commercial herds, the blood test is much less expensive than the fecal test. For me, I usually start with the blood test, especially if I'm trying to determine what the prevalence is in the herd, and then move to the fecal test if we think we absolutely have to.
For producers, if they do unfortunately have it in the herd, what do they need to do with that livestock?
Ethically, they should either slaughter them, which is perfectly okay to do that, or euthanize them. We really don't want them going through the sale barn and spreading this disease to other herds.
You'd mentioned that there are some concerns with it being zoonotic. Can you share with us what those concerns are?
Yeah, so there's several diseases, human Crohn's, type 2 diabetes, juvenile autism, muscular sclerosis. There's 4 or 5 other diseases that people have said this organism predisposes to humans to this. But there's been kind of a switch among some human medical doctors where now they're saying this MAP organism is not associated with Crohn's, but actually causes Crohn's. Now, most of them admit there's a genetic component to it on the human side and an immunosuppressive thing, but there's been this switch to it is actually causing human diseases. And, the worry is it can find it in the milk, you can find the meat. To my knowledge, we've never been able to find it in the milk or the meat in the United States, but it has been found in water, in drinking water. And so that's the concern, is that our animals are contaminating particularly the water, but possibly the milk and the meat, and we're initiating these human diseases.
So you mentioned that sending them to slaughter is a form of prevention, so really not any concern, though, for if the cattle producers are getting that meat back to eat?
No, I mean, the normal heating processes and all that is believed to take care of that. And we do know that pasteurization, especially the way we pasteurize in the United States, basically eliminates all the organisms.
When it comes to Johne's disease, what are your recommendations for cattle producers?
Well, it's a tough one because we can't test the animals that they're typically purchasing. Most cow-calf producers are buying young bulls and or young heifers, and the test is going to be negative. And so because it's a purchase disease, our recommendation is for the person purchasing these animals to ask the seed stock person, do you have Johne's? And then the next question is, are you on a Johne's prevention program? Do you do what we call a Johne's risk assessment every year? And then from there, there's other things we can do. Is like, okay, they don't know if they have Johne's. We can test a small percentage of their herd to determine whether they do, whether the purebred operator will let them do that or not. But if they don't, and the cow-calf producer actually wants this bull or wants this group of heifers, then bringing them on to the facility, they're not going to be shedding, so it should be safe. But I'd recommend that they start testing those animals at 2 years of age every year, at least for the first 3 years of their life, to make sure that they're not actually Johne's positive.
We've focused today's conversation towards cattle, but is there a concern for this disease for other livestock species?
Yeah, we see a lot of it in the goat industry, a little bit in the sheep industry, but certainly it's a ruminant, and that's really the species that it's cows, sheep, and goats, and it's becoming a problem in all three industries.
If people are wanting to find out more information, learn more about this disease, what are your recommendations?
Well, there's a Johne's Information Center in Wisconsin. That's a really good website for this. If they've got specific questions about their operation, of course, talk to their local veterinarian. They're certainly welcome to call KSVDL and ask for me. This is a disease of special interest to me, so I certainly like to talk about it. So one of those three things.
Gregg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure.
That was K-State veterinarian in Kansas State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory in K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. You can read more about Johne's disease by going to johnes.org, which is JOHNES.org, or you can reach out to Gregg through K-State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory, which you can find at ksvdl.org. I will link these resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, Brian Lubbers, Phillip Lancaster, Dustin Pendell, and special guest Ken Odde.
So we talk about trying things. Dustin, I know you've got some questions for us that are related to meat demand.
Yep, and so, last time, if you recall, we talked about international trade, and we had some questions on what do we export, what do we import, who do we export to, et cetera. And the idea was really we're trying to talk about the importance of international trade. Well, I think today's topic, consumer demand, is a lot like that. And the idea is, why do we care about consumer demand? In fact, we've got some colleagues of mine, Ted Schroeder, Glenn Tonzer, Brian Coffey, they study meat demand. So it's obviously a very important topic. And maybe some of our listeners might not necessarily care, but there's a reason why, so at least have an understanding of why it is important to their operations. So we're going to talk about meat demand. I've got a warm-up question for everybody, all right? Can anybody tell me what the per capita consumption of beef is in the United States last year, 2023?
68 pounds.
No, I was going to say it's lower. I was going to say somewhere in the 40s.
Yeah, I think I would say 50 somewhere.
Okay. I'm going to go 49. So you keep the score here?
You want to bid $1, Bob?
No.
Bid $1?
I accidentally saw it. So I'm going to guess 58.1.
Ryan was right. Ryan gets the first point.
Might be a little higher in our household.
Can anybody guess what the most consumed protein source is in the U.S.?
Chicken.
Chicken, poultry, at how much?
Let's go 80.
I'll say 100 pounds per capita. Is that what you're going for?
Yeah, pounds per capita.
I'm going to stay with 68.
Ken?
I'd say about 70.
Yeah, I think it's about 70.
101 last year.
Wow. That's a lot of chicken. Go, Phillip.
Last one would be lamb. Anybody guess what the per capita consumption of lamb is?
I'm going to say like 10.
1.
5. 3.6 for Ken. I said 5.
Yeah, 1 lamb chop per year.
It's 1.12 pounds per year.
Boy.
Yeah, and pork has been just slightly under 50 pounds, but it's been that way for
a long time.
Like 50 years. So it has not changed. So I got a colleague, Dr. Glenn Tonzer, who does a monthly survey. It's called the Meat Demand Monitor, and they survey about 2,000 people, but this is mostly geared towards retail and food service. And so in this report, they ask them a number of questions where they calculate willingness to pay for various products, and then they ask them lots of questions about, are you aware of these kinds of issues, what some of their values help them pick, et cetera. And so one question I'll ask you guys, what's the most important attribute when purchasing protein that consumers respond? So these 2,000 consumers, and this is a monthly survey. If you're interested, we'll talk about where you can find the data and the reports. But what's the most important attribute when purchasing protein?
I'm going to say taste.
Price?
I'd say taste.
I'll say taste too.
It is taste. Now, from a statistical standpoint, I don't know if there's any difference, but taste, freshness, and then a little below is safety and price. Those are generally the four.
Yeah, those four make sense.
Always see. Can anybody talk about what the least, I guess, the most least important attribute?
Like how it was raised?
That could be one.
I would go with that, even though there are brands that are specifically targeting the way they're raised. But based on what you listed as the top 4, I would put that pretty low.
Yeah, I agree.
How they're raised, and so what that could be, organic or grass fed or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know what specifics you want to get to there, but yeah.
So the one that they've got here, they said environmental impact. That kind of surprised me. Environmental impact, and above that would have been traceability, origin of animal, and animal welfare.
Okay.
Excellent. Thanks, Dustin. Great questions there relative to some of our discussion on meat demand and the differences across protein. You want to tell us where we could find more information on that?
So if you're interested in reading these reports, or even if you want to see the raw data, if you go to AgManager.info, and on their website, if you just type in Meat Demand Monitor, that will pop up and all the reports will be there.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.